Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Carl Skau, Deputy Director General, Department for Conflict and Humanitarian Affairs, Ministry for Foreign Affairs, Sweden.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this closing session of the 2020 Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development. It's been a fascinating past 10 days with using cutting-edge technology, bringing together cutting-edge people discussing cutting-edge issues. It's also been the most global forum that we've had with more participants than ever, with over 3,500 people registered, coming from over 165 different countries, and thousands more actually participating via our YouTube channel. We've had 40 sessions at this forum, which also shows the great partnership that this forum represents with a great number of actors and organizations. I want to begin with especially thanking CEPRI for pulling this together, and especially you, Jago, who is on the panel today, who has been the coordinator of this. But I also want to give a special shout out to Sigrun, who's actually in our studio today, who I think was one of the masterminds behind this forum when it first started several years ago, and have now in her position as a deputy at CEPRI also been the driving force behind this year's forum. And I want to really thank her for her contribution also to the partnership between CEPRI and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as she also now comes to the end of her tenure, and we welcome her back to the ministry. I also want to take this opportunity to thank my team at the ministry who have been carrying this forward, particularly Karin and Christians. A big thank to you. It's actually not the final session, but it is the closing open session. We will also have some partner-led sessions to come, but we look forward to try to wrap up some of the discussions we have had in this week and a half. As we have done in the past, we have an online, the interaction with the online audience has been one of the key features, as you know, who have been following this. And I would encourage you to also post questions in this session using the online tool, and we will make sure that we can pick up a few of these questions later on. We will also here introduce what we call the word cloud and invite the audience to write a word. And it should be what in one word captures your key takeaways from this year's forum. Now let us turn to the panel. So today's panel will draw on the sessions of the Stockholm Forum to explore what recommendations to take forward over the coming weeks, months and years as we take on the challenges of peace and security. For this, we have a great group of panelists with us today, and I'm honored to welcome Gillian Triggs, Assistant High Commissioner for Protection at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Very welcome to you, Gillian.
Thank you.
Chebbi is the African Union Youth Envoy. And Nancy Lindborg, who we saw here at the opening as well, is the President and CEO of the United States Institute of Peace. And finally, Jago Salmon is the lead convener of this year's forum and a non-resident fellow with the Center for International Cooperation at NYU. A very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us. Jago, I thought we should kick off with you. You have been the lead convener of the forum, as I said. You led with us at the ministry and CEPRI in shaping the agenda. And I think you are the one who have followed most of the discussions of anyone at this forum. So what are your main takeaways so far, Jago?
Thank you, Carl. It's fantastic to be with you on such an esteemed panel. As you say, the closing public panel of the 2020 Stockholm Forum. I also want to say it's been a real privilege to curate this virtual forum. It's been an incredible event. We decided in the middle of March, when so many other events were being cancelled, that we wanted to test our commitment to resilience and move into virtual space. The fact that we've been able to do so and do so successfully with, as you said, over 165 countries registered. And I think we now have 16,000 YouTube views is thanks for a really amazing team effort. You mentioned a number of people. I want to thank the colleagues in the MFA and CIPRI. I want to particularly thank Martina Selmy, who is the program coordinator who made a lot of this happen. And I want to thank our production team, MKTG, who have been behind the cameras and behind the scenes throughout. I also want to thank the incredible audience that's paid attention to this forum throughout. It really does show that in a time of crisis, we want to come together. We want to solve problems. We don't want us to polarize, as was discussed throughout the forum. And I want to thank our partners who've put on more than 44 sessions. Look, as you mentioned, Carl, I've been unable to travel like many of the audience or many of you. So I've watched the forum almost entirely remotely, which means I'm in a strange position for a curator in that I've seen almost all of the sessions. So I have to resist the urge to summarize what I've seen. So I want to kick off this panel just briefly with one reflection, personal reflection, and then two key takeaways. The personal reflection, which was very present in my mind as we began developing the Forum 2020, was that my career and many of our lives have been determined by three international foreign policy crises: 9/11, the financial crisis, and COVID. I was actually in Yemen for the 9/11, Darfur during the financial crisis, and Burkina as COVID broke out. What's always struck me is that these crises were eminently preventable in many ways, and at the same time, investments in international and national security did not keep us safe. And this was one of the thoughts that really lay behind the structure of this forum. We've covered a lot in 10 days. We've looked at the what of peacebuilding, we've looked at the how of peacebuilding, and we've looked at the who of peacebuilding. We've even looked in great detail at very innovative practices on peacebuilding, often, unfortunately, behind closed doors, but it has been an incredible set of discussions. And we also had the fantastic keynote speech, the electrifying keynote speech by Ilwa Dalman on Wednesday last week, which I highly recommend everybody goes back to view. So my two key takeaways from this forum. Firstly, throughout the forum, and we just heard it now in the previous panel on prevention, many speakers have pointed to COVID-19 as a pivot moment for the world. We've discussed the global impact of COVID with rapidly unfolding impacts on health, economics, and political stability, each moving at their own time and pace. It is possible that we are at this point in time where we're moving away from an easy system of globalization, where we could assume growing interdependence, a sharing of sovereignty, and increased burden sharing. Discussions have drawn attention to the fractures in the Security Council, the fragmentation of the G20 and G7, and the spread of geopolitics to questions of debt, port security, and even healthcare. At the same time, we've had ample examples of what new ways of working, from envoys, from peace operations, from civil society, both technically using virtual tools, but also through diplomacy, reaching new communities, new actors, and involving them in the conversation. As Robert Ribberg said in the opening session, diplomacy can't be put in a quarantine. One of the speakers reminded us early on that the term UN was coined in 1942, 3 years before the UN itself came into being. So we are at this pivot moment. We're at this moment of crisis, but we don't know yet which way we're going. It's the work of all of us that have attended the forum and way beyond that will help determine which direction we travel. My second key takeaway from this is that on the other hand of this global pivot, for many, many people affected by COVID around the world, COVID is not a pivot. It's just another. COVID is just one more risk that people and countries are adding to a long list of risks that they are managing, that they're dealing with. It has not replaced issues. It has compounded them with pre-existing issues such as inequality or insecurity. Even before COVID, when we began planning the forum before the pandemic, the dynamics of opportunity and risk related to conflict were changing beneath our feet. Armed conflict is declining, but violent death is moving to peripheries, slums, cartels, and militias, as we heard from Grieved. Climate change is increasingly a threat multiplier, impacting conflict-affected states disproportionately. In Europe and beyond, we've heard a lot about the proliferation of disinformation and competing narratives, and how our peacebuilding work, like this forum, now has to move online. I think a very powerful intervention on this second point came from the Kenyan Cabinet Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Rachel Amamo. who spoke powerfully of her country's mobilization in the face of a convergence of threats that have left the state asking what it needs to manage climate change, locusts, terrorism, and COVID whilst maintaining sovereignty. So I take those two takeaways from the forum. In 2018, I co-led with colleagues in the UN and the World Bank a joint report, Pathways for Peace. The conclusion of that report was not that the tools of crisis management were not working, in fact, quite the opposite. And over the last 10 days, we've heard how effective many of these tools are. The conclusion was that in the absence of resources and capacity to prevent real threats to people's aspirations and lives, crises and their costs will continue to escalate. Nancy said in the previous panel, we are in an extraordinary moment where these two levels, global and local, converge. It is clear, listening to all the sessions across the forum, that beyond the rhetoric or policy of humanitarian development and peace nexus, we are in a world now where presence on the ground is as important to peace building as political clout in the capital. This is a remarkable opportunity because we have, at the moment, the global review of the UN peacebuilding architecture and a growing constituency of actors, from the World Bank, who's launched their FCV strategy, to the AU reaching consensus on the need to sustain peace through the Aswan Forum. On the other hand, simultaneously, states and communities are reaching out to the international community for a handshake on the SDGs to develop risk-informed development as they try and manage the impacts of COVID. So I'll conclude by saying, we all know as peace builders, peace building is about resolving disputes peacefully while reinforcing institutions to help us prevent crises. Peace building depends on national ownership and national actors, but at the same time, international resource and capacity are essential. We, all of us across the forum, are stakeholders in this system, both in the risks and the benefits. So I'll stop by saying I'm inspired by what I've heard across the forum of the efforts being made by envoys, by youth, by peacekeepers, by NGOs. I'm inspired that we have the knowledge and frameworks around which we can align. I'm inspired that CIPRI, for example, is joining in these efforts with the launch of the Environment of Peace report in 2022. What we need is to move forward from inspiration to greater action and larger resources for these efforts based upon coherent dialogue. It's an increasingly globalized world. We share many benefits. I hope this Stockholm Forum and its move online has been an opportunity for all of you who are watching to galvanize shared discussion and shared ownership over these issues. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Jago, and I think it certainly has been that opportunity. And I thank you also for making a personal reflection, which I can definitely identify with, and also your concrete 2 points and your recommendations in a way going forward. I want you, when you come back, also to reflect a bit on the geopolitical impact, or the let's say that the increasing geopolitical tensions impact on what you just said in terms of your conclusions going forward. But also take forward now what you said about capacity and resources. Nancy, you have been one of the lead contributors to this forum. You've participated first in the discussions on the Red Sea, but also now just before this panel on the discussions on conflict prevention. When you look back at the discussions in the forum, how do you see the prospects for more resources, more capacity, and more international cooperation coming together for international peace building and conflict prevention?
Great, thank you, Carl. Wonderful to be here with this panel, and Jago, thanks for that really, I think, excellent summary and overview of what CIPRI has covered. And I really, really want to congratulate CIPRI for the pivot that it's done. I think against the backdrop of all the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic globally, there has also been this upwelling of creativity and ways in which people have really reached out across divides and at a community, at a personal level, found unbelievable creative ways to move forward. And that's been quite heartening. And I think what CIPRI has been able to do is to really advance core conversations by having the resilience to this pivot. So, you ask about the resources and the way forward. I would make four quick points. And the first is what we discussed in the previous session, and that is we have this extraordinary ripe moment of convergence, as Jago said, of strategies from the World Bank to the Global Fragility Act here at the United States, to the UK strategy, to a lot of the UN work. And we have put a lot of effort really since 2011 on understanding the how to address fragility more effectively, to understand the drivers of conflict, and those core factors that are making the most fragile states so vulnerable to this pandemic, and a lot of conversation on the second and third order effects that are really terrifying and long-term in terms of the security, political, and economic impacts. And there's also been, over the last decade, a lot of movement on the how we do things differently, although less implementation of how to do that. I think a reaffirmation of the complexity in which we work, and the importance and the difficulty of applying some of these core principles of local ownership, inclusiveness, coherence of strategy, and bringing these really into effect is difficult. So all of which leads me to say I'm heartened at the initial response in terms of resources. It's not nearly enough, but there's been a first good round of leaning forward, including the debt relief that we saw coming out of the G20, and the additional resources that the bank and a number of the bilateral donors have brought forward. I'm worried about, number one, that too many of those resources will end up being used for the immediate and the humanitarian, which is a huge and pressing need. And so understandably, that could suck up a lot of these resources at a time where we absolutely need to be thinking about the long term. And my second concern...
Can I ask you on that?
Making...
Sorry to intervene. Can I ask you on that? There are these... there are those who are making the argument that back at the financial crisis, that resource response was much stronger, much more strongly coordinated by the G20, that the countries together stepped up with a much bigger envelope than they have today. How do you reflect on that, given what you just said about the impressive envelope so far?
Well, I said I'm encouraged at the initial response, but I think what we're also seeing is the more developed economies have been really deeply immersed in their own crises. And we've seen that across most of the OECD DAC, where there's been such a focus on the hotspots that we have in Europe and the United States that people are only now starting to look more broadly across the world. And I think fora like CIPRI really helped to bring forward the deep concerns that globally we need to be focused on for what the impacts of this will be. So that can't be the end of the resources, but it has been a response that at least begins to lay the foundation for what will be a long-term enormous effort that's required. And then the final point that I wanted to make is that we are all now challenged in a much more magnified, much more urgent, fast-moving way to apply these principles. All the ways that we've come together to say we need to do things differently with our strategies and our methodologies, and we need to do so at a time where our institutions are not fully set up to do that. We still suffer from slowness with some of our development approaches, long, drawn-out assessment processes, a lot of stovepipes, a lot of institutional mandates that don't allow for complexity to be fully taken on board in delivering assistance, and then also the difficulty sometimes of getting local accountability and local responsibility, which everyone agrees is core. So the opportunity is enormous to fast forward the changes that we need. And I think what Jago said in terms of the pivot moment that we have right now, we need to collectively really be as creative and as an imaginative as we've ever been, and to try to push through some of the institutional barriers. So this is that time. We've been talking about this for a while, and now is the urgent moment to act.
It's great that you both end on the opportunities here, and I think that's inspiring and of course something that we should try to seize. I will now turn to you. As Jago pointed out, we had a very strong keynote from Ilwad Elman last Wednesday, a week ago, and she spoke about our collective responsibility to maintain the multilateral order. Youth are, of course, part of this collective responsibility, yet on Friday we heard about their frustration of lack of action. And these messages, by the way, have also been coming through in a huge response online in our conversations throughout the forum. What would be your key message on youth to this forum?
Thank you very much. Indeed, I watched Elwad's keynote. Elwad is a sister, and she also shares her wisdom with the word out of pain. And probably that's what Stockholm Forum needs to take as well. I think, first of all, we are a generation that is pained, hustling, surviving. It's even called the generation in waithood, waiting for adulthood. And young people in the streets in Africa are saying that we may die of hunger or malnutrition, but not of COVID-19. Or it's the same for me to drown in the Mediterranean or to join a violent extremist group or to die with coronavirus, because I do not enjoy, as a young person, basic human rights. So I think the millennials are carrying a lot of pain and need a lot of healing, and that's why we can't stop talking about mental health. And that healing may come from, as other speakers say, the transformation. Getting really out of this crisis, transitioning to a new world that is providing peace and livelihoods. I would say the second message that it's time to move from the youth peace and security agenda into the youth peace and development agenda, because COVID-19 has forced us to rethink the notion of security or rethink the definition of threat, which came out throughout this week in many panels. Many asked, what is a threat? Is it climate change? Is it terrorism? Is it COVID-19? Is it inequality? What does security really mean when governments impose lockdowns, which increases gender-based violence? What does militarization serve in the face of invisible threats like coronavirus? Can the youth population be protected now by police security or job security? What's more relevant? And when the state also decides to provide jobs, I think it shouldn't be a ticking box for youth empowerment. It's also jobs with dignity. And when we talk about dignity, we shouldn't forget that before the lockdown, young people were in the streets protesting. Revolutions of dignity. The word called it the Arab Spring, but that's a Western narrative. People died for dignity. And the session on protest, I think, should remind everyone that African youth have been challenging the status quo and asking for what we are discussing this week. What we came up with this week have been the slogan of many young people since 2010. In Tunisia, our revolution slogan was jobs, freedom, and dignity. شغل حرية كرامة وطنية. So it's time to move the focus and investment into the right issues, into youth, peace, and development agenda. And my third and last key message, I would say, is the need to institutionalize what I would call intergenerational co-leadership. We are the youngest population in history, but in Africa, we're even the youngest population in the world. 65% of Africa is under 30 years old, and that is projected to double. By 2050, half of the world will be African. So it's a huge demographic dividend, as we call it, but the average age of African leadership is 64 years old, and the average age of the population is 20. We have more than 40 years of generation gap, which is really creating tensions between generations. So I believe that changing the conversation to intergenerational co-leadership could be an approach for conflict prevention. It's not about getting the torch from your generation. It's the possibility of a wider generational collaboration that could be based on experience sharing, on dialogue, on trust, and really allowing young people to thrive in their leadership potential without fear and exclusion. I think we are a continuation of other generation, and we need your wisdom, but you need our innovation to take charge of our own destiny. And besides, I think we're the most innovative and the coolest generation. So let us co-lead with you.
Great, thank you so much for very interesting points. Now, Gillian, I will turn to you. We've had discussions throughout this forum on the impact on humanitarian affairs more broadly from the COVID crisis. But I'm keen to hear from you what you see as some of the main consequences of this pandemic on refugee situations, and what are some of the most important measures that governments and international organizations should take to respond to this?
Well, thank you, and I've enjoyed the discussion. First and foremost, the COVID-19 has been a health crisis, a pandemic. All of us are affected. But the reality is that the pandemic has affected people who are particularly vulnerable in ways that are significantly discriminatory. And if you accept that line, you will understand that from the point of view of UNHCR and humanitarian groups generally, we're concerned with the hundreds of millions of people who are being affected in direct and indirect ways by the COVID-19 pandemic. For refugees, asylum seekers, displaced people, stateless people, registered 80 million, and untold numbers beyond that, are people who are really at the bottom of the pyramid. So that where we've seen economic consequences, the first people to lose their jobs and livelihood have been those of refugee and displaced groups. But perhaps I could return to something which is fundamental, and that is that the pandemic has led to a regressive position, a regression from the global acceptance of the fundamental principles of human rights and of refugee law in particular, so that something in the region of 160 states have closed their boundaries, closed frontiers. They have denied access to those seeking protection categorically. Some have left open the opportunity, but a very significant number have denied it. But compounding that denial of one of the most fundamental principles of international law has been the return or refoulement of those to danger and persecution and to conflict. So what we're seeing is not only a social and economic crisis built upon many, many other crises in different countries, but we're also seeing a very worrying regression from the fundamental norms that underpinned the 21st century approach to human rights. And I think that if we look to the future, we're going to have to rebuild some of those norms, some of those standards that we took for granted for most of my career as a lawyer. We're going to have to rebuild the trust in the institutions of democracies, and we're going to have to understand what the rule of law brings to a stable community and a fair and equitable community, and in those ways to begin to rebuild peace in those areas where conflict is breaking out. So those would be my key immediate concerns to the question, what has been the impact on refugees and displaced people?
Thank you, Gillian. Can I just throw a question back right away? When you talk about the importance now of rebuilding norms, institutions of democracy, rule of law, do you have any pointers on how?
Well, I do. And one is that and it's quite an interesting examination, but a couple of years ago, you may all remember, after the New York Declaration, the Global Compact on refugees and another Global Compact on migration were accepted by the overwhelming majority of states in the international community. And the key ideas behind that tool, if you like, were global solidarity and burden sharing of responsibilities for displaced people and asylum seekers and refugees. Most of that burden lies with 85% lies with the poorest and middle income countries in the world, largely in the global south. There's a huge discrepancy. The idea of solidarity was accepted. No one could have imagined that a couple of years later, the principles underlying the Global Compact should be called to play its role. And sadly, as has really been recognized, some countries have withdrawn into themselves. There's been a shrinking of acceptance of globalization, put at a very broad level. They've shrunk into themselves and said, we will protect ourselves and we will close our borders, we will push back the boats with those seeking protection in the Andean Sea, in the Sea of Bengal, in the Mediterranean, parts of the Caribbean, and of course in the Indian Ocean. But we're seeing that all over the world. So as the Secretary General has recognized, the hope of the compact and the trust in the importance of solidarity globally has been disappointing. But if you ask me how we go into the future, we go into the future by coming back to those core principles. And if I can add my cloud word to others, it is inclusion. One thing we've learned from this pandemic is that we cannot say we'll exclude certain people, we'll keep children out of the education system, we'll deny access to work, we'll refuse access to social networks. It doesn't work that way with a pandemic. We must include all of those within our national systems. And that is the positive side, because I think many countries have understood that. And they can provide best practice. And I think that best practice linked with the, at least so far as refugees and displaced people are concerned, back to the principles of the global compacts, then I think we've got some ways forward that we now understand why that compact and burden sharing globally is so important.
Thank you so much, Gillian, and also thank you for throwing out a word cloud here, your one world. And I want to just remind the audience as well that you're welcome to engage in that way and also to pose questions to the panelists as we proceed. Frankly, I must say that I'm always it might sound old in a way, but I'm always fascinated by the fact that we can connect in this way and that it actually works. I was on a panel the other day where we had China, India, US, Brazil, I'm forgetting, I think, South Africa as well. And, it all worked in a fascinating way. And I think that's maybe one of the contributions of this forum now. I mean, I'm sure there are going to be some to come, but that we have managed to pioneer this new technology and show that it actually works. I hope, though, it's not going to completely replace physical meetings, because I quite look forward to see you all in a different fashion in the future. But I wanted to ask you, Jago, to reflect a little bit on this. What have you learned really about this going virtual, really, before going on to some of the other substance that we picked up in the first round? Jago, over to you.
Thanks, Carl. I mean, I'll come back on a couple of points. I mean, the going virtual, we're living through what possibly is literally the first truly global crisis. I mean, that is happening to everybody around the world. The lockdowns, the economic decline, it's affecting states, it's affecting people, it's affecting regional organizations. So one of the things that we learned by going virtual is how ready everybody was to do that together. Every partner that we approached mobilized very, very quickly to do it. The second thing that we realized is that a lot is possible. You can't do everything. We communicate less efficiently virtually, but a lot is possible. And we're going to internalize that as we look at the Stockholm forums going forward. The third thing that we realized is that by going virtual, there are certain changes that we have to make to do what the Secretary General has said, to build back better. COVID is an opportunity to take forward the Paris commitments, for example, by 10 years and cut our climate impacts already. So on the calculation on the back of an envelope, where we have 3,500 registered participants for the forum, if we had flown all of those people to Stockholm, or they had flown themselves to Stockholm just from the UK, just from where I live, it's the equivalent of running 200 mid-suburban cars in the US for a year. The climate impact of these interactions is heavy. So we've learned that we can engage. We learned that people want to engage. They want to continue these important conversations. And we've learned that it's something that we're going to have to build into our ways of working going forward for climate reasons alone. I won't come back now, but I do want to come back on this question of geopolitics and ownership at some point. Carl.
I will come back to that. We are now picking up some questions also from the audience, and I wanted to turn to you first. My foreign minister said at the opening session that she expected more from the Security Council, following up on the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire. Based on what you've heard at the forum and your own reflections, what would you say to the Security Council and particularly the Permanent Five?
Yeah, I actually wanted to just also jump on the digital conversation, if I may, because
please, yeah.
I think we need to really be mindful that nearly half of the world is offline, which means that half of the world is out of the digital revolution, and most of these are women and girls. And if we look at Africa, 70% of Africa is offline. So even though we celebrate the digital space and we're innovating, and I think this is much, much better than meeting physically and flying extensively, but still, I think we need to be mindful that there are people who are out of these spaces. And if we talk about inclusion, then these conversations, and not only conversations like this, but even disrupting education, because many people have the luxury to go on e-learning, but many people who are out of school cannot have education. So I just wanted to make that, just contribute that to that question. And then on the UN Security Council, I think the call of the Secretary General was very clear and build momentum. And as Elwad said in her keynote, the momentum went really high, and then at the same time it died, and we didn't build on that. But in the African Union, we have been running a campaign called Silencing the Guns by 2020, and it's the theme of the year of the African Union this year. And we have a resolution at the UN Security Council on silencing the guns. I briefed them last year on a first session on youth mobilizing for silencing the guns. So I think the demands for young people are the same. If we want to really all be safe, every one of us have to be safe. And this is a global community. And the failure of the multilateralism or questioning multilateralism right now in this phase of COVID-19 shows that this doesn't, differentiate between developing countries and developed countries. This doesn't differentiate, between different power dynamics in the world. And I think the United Nations Security Council need to wake up. Honestly, need to wake up and serve the people they are there to serve, and really take the decision that delivers for the people and that takes people's lives and safety in consideration. And if they really have that responsibility, then they need to stop violence. Just stop violence and silence these guns. And if they cannot be silenced when we have lockdowns and social distancing and physical distancing, when are they going to be silenced? And yet in Africa, we have conflicts continue. The coronavirus didn't disrupt them. They are continuing. And so I think also in terms of Africa representation, it is time to have a permanent seat at the UN Security Council. The African Union has been calling for it. There are many other countries that have been supporting it. And I think it's time also to rethink what is the Security Council in its composition and how it should move forward.
Thank you. A great message to the Council and also good pitch for an additional permanent seat for Africa on the Council. Nancy, we have a question here, I think, for you, pointing to that the world spends about $2,000 billion a year on military defense. I think someone at the UN told me, and I'm not going to say that only 24 hours of the Pentagon budget was the same as the annual budget of the United Nations. I'm not sure if it's true, but it points in the direction that a lot of money is spent on military and defense. And this is very little in comparison to defense to mitigate climate change, to develop health services and spread wealth. And so the point of the question, I think, is how do we redirect world resources to peace efforts and to these social aspects instead of defense?
I think part of that answer rests with the comment that Gillian made that I wanted to respond to when Gillian, you talked about the need to reaffirm some of these core values, some of these core ideas that have animated many of us or, the world for the last 50, 70 years. And I think the pandemic, as part of the reset moment that it presents us with, is understanding that in order to get on the other side of this pandemic, we absolutely need to invoke and reaffirm a lot of those core ideas. about the importance of global cooperation. That for each of us, we need everyone to be healthy. That's all a part of it. And I think the concept of security will come under scrutiny again in terms of what are the ways of ensuring security and the limits of military security. In December, the Global Fragility Act, as I mentioned, was passed here in Washington with bipartisan and bicameral support. And it really recognized that a decade and a half of pursuing the global extremist agenda with a heavy emphasis on military means was simply not making the difference that we needed. And that you saw in those states with a weak state society compact, states that had a lot of social fragmentation and inequity, that was the common denominator for global extremism, as well as poverty and conflict and pandemics, which has now come to pass. And so it was a recognition that to really address those core drivers of fragility, there needed to be greater coherence between development diplomacy and security understanding. I think in so many ways, this pandemic is an accelerator of looking at core strategies, how we address these issues in very different ways. And I loved what Aya said about the power of the youth voice and the need to look at intergenerational leadership, because what we have so important in all of this is the role of local leadership. And the youth of these fragile countries will be fundamental in terms of demanding and holding accountable leadership for acting differently that then enable international coherence to be more effective as well. I mean, it's local, it's global, it's international. I'm sticking to my hopeful point that this is a reset moment and that there is the opportunity to really rethink how we do these things based on the strategies that we've all already upon. It's right there. So this is that moment to apply them, the tools and the methodologies.
Great, Nancy. Let me get to you, Jago, and you have a go on the geopolitics on this. My point is really that when we look at many of the conflicts, prolonged conflicts that we have, that even if we got the national politics right, even if we got the resources and the investments in the developmental aspects, would we actually be able to come out of this conflict? You've pointed to also the stress that the crisis and its economic impact is putting on fragile states, but it has also increased tensions in the geopolitical space. And so, how do we deal with that? And how is that a factor also going forward in promoting peace? Jago, over to you.
Thanks, Colin. I just want to really agree with what Nancy was saying and Aya and Gillian were saying, because I think we're converging on that we have urgent work that needs to be done, but there is optimism here. I also believe that we are at a pivot point, and it may be that we head in a very positive direction coming out of this. On the geopolitics, I mean, we had a series of interesting conversations at the forum. One on the geopolitical specifically was the emergence of new actors on peace building. Russia, China, South Africa, you mentioned it. And these, for COVID, it's a very real question. A lot of the OECD DAC countries have resorted to almost unprecedented policy tools to safeguard their economies and their populations against the economic impact of COVID. And the reality is that for many particularly fragile countries, they don't have the policy space or the policy flexibility to do that. They rely very heavily on the international community, and particularly the IFIs, the IMF and the World Bank. And there are very concrete actions that will be taken, and some of them have been taken, such as the debt relief agreements that Nancy referenced. So that the geopolitics comes down to the people sat around the boards in the World Bank, around the Security Council, and their ability to agree. That's my first point. The second point is I want to reference briefly the Red Sea panel that Nancy and USIP convened. What it really brought forward was that in the modern world, there's a tremendous willingness to collaborate, but countries and people are dealing with a whole range of risks where we haven't yet really agreed what the boards are, what those boardrooms might look like, where we could navigate them. from maritime security to stabilization to violent extremism. And there's an opportunity here on the geopolitics, not just to look at the global level, but to look at the regional level where this is really spilling out very, very heavily, where the geopolitics is spilling out into regional competition and regional conflicts. And I'll end with a key point, which is this is all peace building, whether we're doing it at a community level or we're doing it between ambassadors in New York. And the true crisis of peace building in many ways is not behind the bureaucracies, behind the resource questions, behind the capacity questions, is always the question of who owns the peace? Whose peace is this? And where is it negotiated? And in those negotiations, there's always a balance. We know, it's clear now, that the more inclusive the settlements are of women, of youth, of businesses, the more resilient they are over time. We also know that in many cases, when negotiating with armed groups, big or small, that we have to accommodate their clear interests as well. And so all of these negotiations are balanced between building inclusion and recognizing interest. And I'll end by saying is that when we deal with the geopolitics, this crisis of ownership doesn't belong to states alone. And to nod to Aya, we really made an effort this year at the forum to bring in youth voices across the keynote, across different panels, across the different sessions. And the voices have really been quite consistent, which is, in many ways, we're not the youth. If we're 70% of the population, we're the population. And we're having to dialogue outside of these boardrooms, outside of these chambers, because we're not represented. So we have to be careful with geopolitics because we need to balance ownership between the states, between the broader stakeholders. And I think youth and women are extremely important in how we do that.
Great, Jago. I think we've come to kind of the... Yes, please, jump in, Nancy.
Well, I just wanted to pick up and add to the word cloud that now Gillian and Jago have both started on inclusion, because I loved an article that I read this weekend that showed the countries that are being fastest to recover from the pandemic are those that are women-led. And it's not that they are per se led by women, but that women-led countries are indicative of more inclusive societies. And so we know from the peace building world that that's important for building peace. We're seeing that it's important for getting out of the pandemics. So again, my point that we're having this convergence where we have to address these core principles that we've all been talking about. So I'll pile on the inclusive word cloud.
So I think inclusion and opportunity so far are the key words in this panel. Gillian, I think we're now doing our final round in a way. You have about a couple of minutes to round up, and I think we should stay with the idea of opportunity, what opportunities we are and how to seize those. And also, Gillian, you were with UNHCR, but in this panel you kind of represent the United Nations, I think. Would you also reflect in your concluding remarks now on what opportunity there are for the United Nations to come out strengthened from this crisis?
I think the United Nations will be seen as having played a very significant role. The Secretary General, for example, called for a ceasefire, and that's been modestly successful in some countries. But perhaps even beyond that has been the extraordinary collaboration between the agencies of the UN. Is one of the struggles for the Secretary General is to bring us all together, the one UN. And that is one of the achievements, actually, over these last few months. That's at the top end. That's as a political, New York diplomatic world, as well as the work that we all do in the field. But one thing I think that we haven't had a chance to talk about is I think individuals whose families have been touched by COVID, a family member has died, they've lost work, the children are not in school, we've had a rise in sexual violence in the community generally. I'm wondering, and I'm hoping, that this pivot that we've been talking about will in fact be that ownership of this future of ours rests with individuals, and we will start to use our political power wonderfully if they're the young ones, but the old ones can do it too. Let's get out there and say this has been global, this has exposed the fragility, And may I just also point out that we've talked a lot about fragile states. The worst of the effects of COVID have been in the richest states. We don't know what's going to happen in the next few months. And I pray that we will not have a huge pandemic in Africa, although the numbers are growing. But nonetheless, let us remember that the strong states with strong health systems haven't done very well either. And we've got to start looking at what's been going wrong, and we own it individually. And I'd love to see the youth of Africa with the youth of Asia and Europe itself come together and say, let us look at how our political systems have allowed us to decline to this level, that we cannot cope with a pandemic that we should have been able to cope with. And I think Jago has said this is one of the three major catastrophic events in the last few decades, and they were preventable, or at least reducible in their impact on human beings.
Thank you so much, Gillian. I will turn to you for your 2 minutes, and then I actually will also give you a question from the audience, which goes to what you answered before in a way, but would you consider the current COVID-19 as an opportunity for larger global engagement, or are we excluding too many people who are not connected? So it's part of the discussion we had just before, but also, please, if you have any concluding points to make. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to build on what has been just said on Africa not being the hardest hit. I think Africa perhaps is more resilient and is showing the world things that they can learn from, because we had Ebola outbreak, and besides the this pandemic COVID-19, we have co-infections of malaria and HIV and other burdens. So I think Africa also has a lot of learning to offer to the world and to the rich countries on how to cope with such pandemic. And I think that's where it presents the opportunity of collaboration. That's where it presents an opportunity of looking at us as one humanity and really ending this inequality. I want also to add on female leadership, because it came out in many panels during this forum. And I think it's really important to know that there is a discrepancy between the women who are health workers and who are peace builders and those who are at the decision-making table. We have been out of 55 African health ministers, and probably that's the highest in many continents. But we need women in leadership, because we have a leadership that is collaborative and emotionally intelligent, and we badly need that. In the digital space, I think, yes, there is a lot of exclusion, and yes, we are leaving so many people behind, the remote areas, the rural youth, the IDPs, the refugees, the migrants, the people with disability. It's a long list of people who are out of these conversations and who are out of the prevention measures and response to the pandemic. But I think, again, it is about global solidarity, and it is about learning from each other's experiences and trying to implement those best practices and looking at us as one humankind going out of this pandemic. And I wanted to end maybe with a call to action to African youth, particularly to global solidarity as well, because we're going to celebrate Africa Liberation Day on 25th of May on Monday. And the liberation movement taught us that Pan-Africanism, which is Ubuntu, which is coming together, can liberate us from oppression and colonization. And I think we want to use that same spirit to liberate ourselves from this pandemic. So I call on all Africans in Africa and the diaspora and global community use this date to donate, to support, to volunteer, to really come together for Africa as well, because indeed the rates are coming to a peak, and we need everyone to make sure that we all in this together to be all safe.
Great, Aya. Now over to you, Nancy. I think we are running short of time, so if you can stick to a minute with some final messages, and then over to Jago right away.
So one of the wise things I heard this week was that the pandemic is confirming whatever assumptions you went into the pandemic with. And so I say that just that all of us need to be really pushing ourselves to think hard about what are the opportunities and how do we really move forward, and pick up Aya's offer of harnessing the innovation and the imagination of the youth, because we really do need to rethink some of the structures that enable us to deliver these core principles that we've learned the hard way over the last decade and a half, and come up with all the ways to really chart a way forward that's healthier and more peaceful.
Jago.
Thank you. So I'll end by just saying, look, I mean, it comes down to individuals. It comes down to people. It comes down to leadership. And I really think I take away from the forum, and I look across the panel of women leaders, which I've had the honor of joining, and I really think that leadership is going to have to well up and act. And move global frameworks down to national level and operations and results. I'll end with one sentence. A wise thing I heard on the forum: when we're scared, we turn inwards. It's psychological. It's built into us. But we know that to thrive as individuals or families, we must collaborate. It's a yin-yang of being a human being. And I've take a lot of inspiration from how many people have spoken about the future of collaboration at the forum and the actions that they're taking to build that future now. Collaboration is the new realism, Dan Smith, the director of CIPRI, mentioned in the first session. And I think it's a very good thing to take away from us. In this very globalized world, where the benefits and risks are shared, we can walk away from the table for 1, 2, 3 years. But if we're going to thrive, we are going to have to come back to the table and collaborate. So that's my last optimistic point there. And thank you.
Great. We thank you for a fascinating panel. I think we're now going to check the cloud word. We had already a few coming from the panel. But they should be on your screens now. I'm not gonna try to summarize this, but I think this just gives a good flash of what some of the audience is taking away, not only from today's panel, but also from the panels that we've heard over the past 10 days and the 40 panels. I'm not gonna really try to wrap up all this discussion, but just to say some key words that maybe I take away from having listened to this, and it very much also summarizes what I think was discussed today. But the first, that the COVID-19 crisis is really a transformative moment. But I also take away what Nancy just pointed out, that what we have seen so far is maybe that pre-existing divisions has to some degree been been deepened. If you were a nationalist before this crisis, you are probably an even more convinced nationalist now. If you believed in multilateralism and cooperation before this crisis, you are even more convinced. And so I think there is still a challenge to overcome these divisions that we've seen at the short run to be deepened. I think another point is the changing nature of risks. Jago pointed to that we were surprised about terrorism in a way in 9/11. We were then surprised about the financial risks and the financial crisis. And now in some way we are surprised or taken aback by this pandemic. And I think some of these risks were clearly out there to be seen. And I think what we need to do moving forward is also to set up a system that can better manage these risks so that we make sure that we prevent what come next. A third is, of course, inclusion, the role of women, but also the growing importance of involving youth. And I'm particularly thankful, Aya, that you were with us today and the clear messages that you sent not only to us and to the broader Africa and community, but also to the Security Council. And I think this is one of the key points that we take away from this forum as well. And my final point is on international cooperation. It's clearly that we need international cooperation to build back better, which was one of the slogans of this forum. And as part of that, we really need diplomacy and dialogue. And I think the massive attention to this forum and participation that we've seen also shows that there was appetite to come together and have these discussions. Diplomacy, as my state secretary set out at the opening audience, cannot be put in quarantine. We need dialogue, we need diplomacy. And I think that we might in the short term close down and turn inward, but we will soon realize that to face the challenges that we all have, we will need to work together. And so I think I'll end with what Dan Smith, the executive director of CEPRI, said at the opening session, that in a way, international cooperation is really the new realism. And I think that is something that I really take away from this panel. We need more collaboration and partnership and cooperation, not less. And I think we should end, and I'm happy that we are ending with a panel that has really pointed to the opportunities that this crisis also provide, and let's make sure that we seize them. Thank you so much for everyone who has participated, who have joined in and listened, and a big thanks from Stockholm, and I wish you a good evening, and thank you.